Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to guide my way.
A lot of people don't like poetry. You may not know it, but there is a great deal of poetry in Scripture. You say you're not interested? What if I tell you a great deal of what the prophets wrote was in poetic form? You know, people like studying prophecy, especially from the standpoint of the end times. Most of those prophecies are actually in poetic style. I've heard Bible class teachers explain to their class that Hebrew poetry is classified as poetry because it would rhyme if we could read it in the original language. Wrong. If the class concludes that it's all about the rhyme, they're going to abandon its true power. The class will then be forced to study the material without the true features that make it so compelling and beautiful. How sad. Because rather than looking for a rhyme at the end of certain lines, the ancient people were looking at the meanings of successive lines. This is called parallelism, where a line is developed further in parallel lines that follow. At times, this helps us understand a passage better. Sometimes it amplifies the intention and makes it far more stirring or possibly condemning. The use of this poetic style can become very complex, sometimes spanning several verses, even creating alternating thoughts that interconnect. But it's far more common for Hebrew poetry to be simple and very straightforward. For this study, we have to keep things simple, but we can get a really good idea of what Hebrew poetry was about by studying the four types. Let's look at the first of those four, and then we'll cover three more in our next video. The first type is synonymous parallelism. That sounds confusing, but it's not. When you talk about synonyms, you're talking about two words that mean essentially the same thing, aren't you? In synonymous parallelism, the meaning or idea of a line is then repeated with different words, but they mean the same thing. So the second line is synonymous with the first line. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23, we have a well-developed poem spoken by Lamech. The parallels are established from the very beginning of the poem in the names of his wives and his plea for them to listen to him. If we don't understand the parallelism being used, we conclude that Lamech killed a man and a boy, two people. But he's actually saying that he killed a man for striking him and that the one he killed was just a youth. Psalm 49 in verse 1 makes a plea to a certain scope of people. The plea is to hear and give ear, meaning exactly the same thing. They're synonymous. The admonition is for all people and all inhabitants of the earth, synonymous again, thus referring to the same scope. I've placed a few other examples down at the bottom of the screen for you to consider. Comparative lines allow for very expressive descriptions. You may have heard the proverb, as a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion, Proverbs 11:22. The beautiful woman is represented by the ring of gold, and her lack of discretion places her in a swine's snout. Suddenly, what would be desirable to a young man looking only at the outward appearance becomes something very disgusting and repulsive. That's the power of this form of poetry. Well, I hope you'll join me in our next video as we compare three other forms of Hebrew poetry.